My daughter didn't come when the paramedics called her. My son-in-law picked up, listened for 10 seconds, then told the hospital it wasn't their problem. I was 67 years old, bleeding into my skull on the floor of my own kitchen in Sudbury, and the only two people I had left in this world decided they had better things to do. They came eventually, 3 days later, not to see me, to find the will. But when they walked into that room, my bed was empty, and what they found instead changed everything. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you. The cold hit me first. That's the thing nobody tells you about collapsing. It's not the pain that registers, it's the floor. The linoleum in my kitchen has been there since Margaret and I moved into that house in 1987. I know every crack in it. When I opened my eyes and felt my cheek pressed against it, I knew exactly where I was, even before I understood what had happened. I tried to sit up. My left arm wouldn't answer. My head felt like someone had split it down the middle with a wedge and left the wedge in. I'd had a stroke. I didn't know that yet, but some part of me understood. The way the room tilted sideways, the way my thoughts kept slipping like wet paper. I'd watched my own father go through it 20 years ago, and even half-conscious on that kitchen floor, something in me recognized the shape of what was happening. My phone was on the counter, 4 feet away. I don't know how long it took me to drag myself across that floor, long enough that by the time I reached it, I was shaking so hard I could barely unlock the screen. I called my daughter. She didn't answer. I called again. On the third try, my son-in-law picked up. I could hear the television in the background. A hockey game. Toronto was playing someone. "It's your father," I said. Or I tried to say it. The words came out garbled, thick, like speaking through a mouthful of cotton. There was a pause. Then his voice flat and annoyed. "I can't understand you. Call back when you're not drunk." He hung up. I lay there on the kitchen floor for another hour before the neighbor found me. Meredith, 73 years old and sharp as anyone I've ever known, had come over to return a casserole dish. She saw me through the window. She's the one who called 911. She's the one who rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand, telling me I was going to be fine. Meredith, not my daughter, not my son-in-law, a neighbor. The first 3 days in the ICU at Health Sciences North, I drifted in and out of consciousness. The doctors told me later that I'd had a significant ischemic stroke right hemisphere. They'd acted fast enough. The damage was manageable. I was lucky. Lucky. I kept turning that word over in my mind, trying to find an angle where it fit. When I finally came fully awake, really awake, aware of where I was and what had happened, the first thing I saw was the ceiling. Drop tiles, fluorescent lighting, the particular shade of beige that hospitals seem to manufacture specifically to make you feel like you're already halfway gone. The second thing I saw was Dr. Okafor standing at the foot of the bed. She was young, maybe 35, with close-cropped hair and a way of delivering information that was direct without being cruel. She told me my name back to me, asked me a series of questions to assess where I was cognitively, seemed satisfied with my answers. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I fell," I said. The words were still a little slow, but they were coming. "You did fall. Do you remember what happened before that?" I told her what I remembered. The kitchen, the floor, the phone. She made a note on her tablet, then looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. That's when I knew something else was coming. "Your daughter was contacted," she said carefully, "and your son-in-law. On the first day and again on the second." I waited. "They were informed that your condition was serious." She chose each word the way you choose footing on ice. "That your prognosis was uncertain. That family presence can be meaningful in these situations." "They didn't come," I said. It wasn't a question. I already knew. The way you know certain things about the people you love, even the things you've spent years pretending not to know. Dr. Okafor looked down at her tablet. "No, they didn't come." The room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a cart wheeled by. Someone laughed, distant and bright, completely at odds with the weight pressing down on my chest. I'd given my daughter everything, not in the overblown way people say that, meaning money and gifts. I mean everything. When her mother died 7 years ago, my daughter was 28 and unraveling. I sold the small investment property Margaret and I had saved for 20 years to buy. Sold it to clear my daughter's debt. Her husband had lost his job and they were 3 months behind on their mortgage in Barrie. I paid it off. I gave them the breathing room. I told myself it was what Margaret would have wanted. When my son-in-law started his contracting business, I co-signed. I sat at that lawyer's table and put my name next to his on a $90,000 loan because my daughter asked me to. He never paid it back. We stopped talking about it after the first year. I stopped asking. I told myself that was love too. Margaret's voice came to me then, the way it does sometimes in moments when I need to hear something true. She had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things without being unkind. She would have said, "You taught them what you would accept." And she would have been right. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Dr. Okafor. She nodded. "You should rest, but I want you to know Meredith has called twice to check on you. And a man named Owen called this morning, said he was your lawyer and your oldest friend, and that I should tell you he's coming Thursday." Owen. I hadn't thought about Owen in a few days, which meant the medication was stronger than I realized. In ordinary life, Owen takes up a fair amount of my thinking. We've been friends since we were both first-year engineers at Laurentian, back when he was still running. We lost touch for a decade when I moved to Sudbury and he stayed in Ottawa. Found each other again at Margaret's funeral of all places. He showed up, unannounced, and stood in the back of that church, and afterward he drove me home without asking, made tea, and sat with me until I stopped being unable to speak. He'd been my lawyer ever since. If Owen was coming Thursday, then Owen had been thinking. I leaned back against the pillow and let the ceiling be what it was. A thought moved through me, slow and deliberate. They hadn't come when I was dying, but they would come eventually, when the paperwork mattered. I knew my daughter and my son-in-law well enough to know that much. The only question was what I was going to do about it. Owen arrived Thursday morning with a paper bag from a Tim Hortons on the way up the 69 and a specific expression he gets when he's been planning something in his car. I've known him long enough to read that expression the way you read weather. He pulled the chair close, handed me a coffee, black, no sugar, he remembered, and sat down without preamble. "How's the left side?" he asked. "Better. Physio starts Monday." "Good." He opened his bag, took out a breakfast sandwich, and began eating with the focused calm of a man who intended to talk business once the basics were handled. I've always appreciated this about Owen. He doesn't perform concern, he just shows up. After a few minutes, he folded the wrapper, looked at me directly, and said, "They've been in touch with a real estate lawyer in Barrie." I absorbed that. "How do you know?" "Because I know your son-in-law's former business partner, who has reason to keep tabs on him, and because I still know people who talk." Owen shrugged lightly. "They're asking about the house, the timeline for probate. What happens to assets if there's no updated will?" The house. The house that Margaret and I had bought when we were both 31, young and terrified and absolutely certain we were doing the right thing. The house where I still had her handwriting on the inside of the kitchen cabinet door, where she'd written the kids' heights in pencil every year until the pencil stopped. "They think I'm done," I said. "They're hoping you're done," Owen said. He paused. "Are you?" I looked at the window. Outside, early March in northern Ontario, which means gray and unforgiving and still somehow beautiful if you've lived there long enough to know what it becomes. The birches along the parking lot were still bare. In 6 weeks they'd be green. "No," I said. Owen nodded, as if this was what he'd already decided. "Then let's talk about what you want." What I wanted? It was a strange question to sit with because I'd spent the last 7 years wanting things that were really just the absence of pain. I wanted my daughter to become the person I'd raised her to be. I wanted my son-in-law to stop treating me like a resource. I wanted Margaret back. which was the one thing no amount of careful planning could address. But sitting in that hospital bed, my left hand still not quite where I wanted it to be, with Owen across from me eating a Tim Hortons sandwich and the Birch's bear outside, I found something harder and cleaner underneath all of that. I was done waiting for people to deserve what I gave them. "The will," I said. "I want to change it." Owen reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a legal pad. "Tell me what you're thinking." We talked for 2 hours. By the time Dr. Okafor came by for afternoon rounds and told Owen politely but firmly that I needed to sleep, we had the outline of something. The house would go to Meredith. Not the building, but the right to live there for the rest of her life. After that, it would go to the Northern Ontario Hospice Fund that had taken care of Margaret in her final weeks. I remembered those nurses. I remembered what it meant to have people who showed up. The rest, the investments, the savings account, the small pension payout, would go to a bursary at the college in Sudbury. To be called the Margaret Lindquist Bursary for students in the skilled trades, Margaret had been a machinist for 30 years. She would have approved. My daughter and son-in-law would receive a letter, that was all. Owen stayed for the notarization. He'd brought a notary public with him from Ottawa. A quiet woman named Dr. Fraser who asked the right questions, verified I was sound of mind, and witnessed everything without comment or ceremony. It was done by 4 in the afternoon. I felt something shift in my chest, not happiness, exactly, clarity. Like a window that had been painted shut for years had finally been opened. 2 days later, they arrived. I heard them before I saw them. My son-in-law's voice carrying down the hallway, impatient, asking the nurse where room 14 was. My daughter's heels on the linoleum. I'd know those sounds anywhere. I'd spent 30 years listening for them. By the time they turned the corner into the hallway, my bed was empty. Owen had arranged it. He had an instinct for theater that he'd never fully suppressed, despite 40 years of legal work. He'd spoken to Dr. Dauber. Okafor explained the situation in broad strokes, and together they'd agreed that I would be moved to a rehab room on the 3rd floor that afternoon, under my middle name, William, as a precaution for privacy. Technically, I was a different patient. On the pillow where I had been, Owen left an envelope. I was not there to see their faces when they found it, but Owen was. He positioned himself down the hall with his coffee and his ability to look like he was simply an older man waiting for nothing in particular. He called me that evening. "Your daughter opened it," he said. She read the first page. She sat down on the edge of the bed. A pause. Your son-in-law read over her shoulder. He went very still. Did they say anything? Your son-in-law said, "This can't be legal." What did you do? I walked over and introduced myself. Owen's voice held something that was almost amusement. Told him it was entirely legal. Told him it had been witnessed and filed. Told him they were welcome to contest it, which would cost them significantly more than they stood to gain. A beat. He didn't enjoy that. "No," I said. "I imagine not." My daughter called that night. I'd been expecting it. I answered on the second ring. "Dad." Her voice was tight, the way it gets when she's trying to hold several things at once and can't quite manage all of them. "What is this?" "You read the letter," I said. "This isn't like you." That particular sentence. I've heard it before. Usually when I've done something that inconveniences her and she's trying to make me feel like the unreasonable one. "I was in the hospital for 3 days," I said. "Serious enough that the doctors called you twice." Silence. "You didn't come," I said. "Neither of you." "We didn't know it was that bad." Her voice shifted into something softer, more careful. "We thought you were overreacting. You know how you can be." "I know how I can be." I thought about the kitchen floor, the linoleum, the way my arm wouldn't move. I thought about Meredith, 73 years old, coming over with a casserole dish and saving my life because she'd seen me through a window. "I wasn't overreacting," I said quietly. "Dad, please, we're sorry, we'll come up, we can talk about this in person." "I'd like you not to," I said. A pause. "What?" I'd like you to go home. I'm in rehab now. I have physiotherapy twice a day. I have Owen, and I have Meredith, and I have the care team here. I don't need you to come up and manage me. We're not trying to manage you. The will is filed, I said. It's not going to change, but that's not really what I want to talk to you about. She was quiet then, waiting. I'm your father, I said. I'll always be your father. What I did this week, the changes, the letter, that wasn't to punish you. It was to stop pretending. I've been pretending for a long time that things between us are fine, that the money I've given you over the years was love freely received and not just you taking what was available. I stopped being honest about what I needed from you. That's on me too. She didn't say anything. I'm not going to be an ATM anymore, I said, and I'm not going to wait around for you to show up at the end of my life and act like you earned something, but I'm not your enemy either. If you want a real relationship, I'm here for that. I'd like that. I'd genuinely like that. I'd genuinely like that. The line was very quiet. I don't know what to say, she finally said. You don't have to say anything tonight, I said. Get some sleep, so will I. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in the dark of the rehab room. The window faced east toward the nickel range, and there was enough reflected light from the parking lot below to make out the shapes of things. A chair. An IV pole I no longer needed. The small framed photo the nurse had brought over from my original room. Me and Margaret, taken on a dock somewhere in Muskoka. Both of us squinting in the sun. Both of us laughing at something just outside the frame. I kept it on the windowsill where I could see it. Margaret had always said, people will treat you the way you show them you expect to be treated. I'd heard her say it 100 times, mostly about other people's situations, never understanding she was also saying it about mine. 7 years too late, maybe, but better than never. The physio team at Health Sciences North was something else. Sanjay, short, brisk, with hands like a mechanic, had me walking the corridor by the end of the first week. Not gracefully. My left foot still dragged a little, and my left hand had the grip strength of a child, but I was walking. He said without particular emotion that I had done well for someone my age who hadn't taken care of themselves. I told him I had actually taken pretty good care of myself. He looked at my chart and said, better than some. That was the closest thing to a compliment I received from Sanjay, and I treasured it. Owen came back the following week, and we sat in the rehab lounge with bad hospital coffee and talked about what came next. You could sell the house, he said, move somewhere smaller. This is a lot to manage alone. I'm not alone, I said. Meredith's right next door. He raised an eyebrow. Not like that, I said, just, she's there, and she makes very good soup. He smiled into his coffee. What about the contracting loan? Your name's still on it. Let it go to collections, I said. My credit score at 67 is not my primary concern. He laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him. I mean it, I said. I spent 20 years protecting my credit rating out of some idea that it represented something about my character. It doesn't. It's a number. Let him deal with the fallout. Owen nodded slowly. You seem different. I had a stroke, I said. No, he said. That's not what I mean. I looked out the lounge window. A family was walking in from the parking lot. A man about my age, a younger woman, a child running ahead with its arms out. No coat despite the cold. The man walked slowly, carefully, the way you walk when your body has become something you have to negotiate with. The woman had her hand under his elbow, not holding, just there. I watched them until they went inside. I stopped being afraid, I said. That's what changed. I'd been afraid for years that if I stopped giving them things, they'd leave, and then they left anyway. They left when it cost them something to stay. I paused. Turns out the thing I was afraid of was already true. Once you know that, there's nothing left to lose. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Margaret would have liked to hear you say that. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to say anything more. 3 weeks after I was admitted, I went home. Meredith drove. She arrived at the main entrance in her old Subaru with a thermos of coffee and a plastic container of butter tarts she insisted were for the road, not for right now, although she let me eat 2 before we'd even left the parking lot. The drive back through Sudbury was ordinary and familiar and entirely unreasonably good. The Canadian Tire on the Sow. The overpass on the Kingsway. The way the city feels bigger than it is because of the open sky above it. The shield just visible at the edges of everything. My house. My driveway still sanded from the last snowfall. My front door. I stood on the porch for a moment before I went in, just feeling the cold air in my lungs. The birches along the fence line were beginning to show the faintest green at the tips of the branches. First sign. 6 weeks, I'd thought from the hospital window. I'd been right. Inside, it smelled like the house always smells. Wood smoke and old books and something faintly of coffee. Meredith had come by to air it out and leave fresh groceries. She'd left a note on the counter, soup in the fridge, don't argue. I didn't argue. I stood for a while in the kitchen, not doing anything. The floor was just the floor. The linoleum with its familiar cracks. The cabinet door where Margaret had measured the children's heights, a habit she'd kept up long past when it made sense, marking the dates in her careful printing right up until the year everything began to go wrong. I didn't look at it with grief that afternoon. I looked at it the way you look at something that has survived everything. A month later, I got a letter, not from my daughter, from my son-in-law. 1 page handwritten, which surprised me more than anything. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was something. He said he understood that things between us had reached a point that couldn't simply be backed away from. He said he knew he had taken advantage of my generosity for a long time, and that he hadn't thought of it in those terms at the time, but that he was thinking about it now. He said he didn't expect anything from me. I read it twice. I put it in the drawer with the other things I didn't know what to do with yet. My daughter called on a Sunday in April. Not about money, not about the will. She just called. She asked how the physiotherapy was going. She asked about Meredith. She seemed uncertain, off balance, like someone trying to walk on a surface they'd never learned to walk on. I didn't make it easy, but I didn't make it impossible. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee going cold and thought about what I wanted from the years I had left. Not what I owed anyone. Not what I needed to protect. What I actually wanted. I thought about the bursary. I'd gotten a letter from the college confirming the fund had been received and would be active for the fall intake. They'd asked if I wanted to meet the first recipient when they were chosen. I'd said yes. I thought about the hospice, about the nurses who had been with Margaret, the ones who'd sat with her at 2 a.m. so I could go home and sleep for 4 hours. I'd been meaning to go back there, to thank them properly. I'd been meaning to for 7 years and never gone. I thought about that family in the parking lot, the man walking carefully, the hand under his elbow. I picked up the phone and called Owen. "You busy?" I said. "Never for you," he said. "What do you need?" "I need someone to come for dinner on Friday," I said. "Meredith's making her soup. I'm going to try to make something besides eggs. It'll be bad, but I'll try." He laughed. "I'll bring wine." "Bring the good stuff," I said. "We're celebrating." "What are we celebrating?" I looked out the window. The birches were fully green now, moving lightly in the April wind, the whole yard shifting and alive. "Still being here," I said. "There's something nobody warned you about when you get older. It's not the body slowing down or the way certain names start disappearing from your address book. It's the moment you realize the story you've been telling yourself about your own life isn't quite true. I told myself for years that I was being generous. That every check I signed, every loan I co-signed, every time I said yes when I should have said no. I told myself that was love. And maybe some of it was, but some of it was also fear. Fear that if I stopped giving, they'd stop staying. And here's what I know now. Lying in a rehab room in Sudbury with a physiotherapist named Sanjay telling me my grip strength is improving. The thing you're afraid of losing was already gone. You were just the last one to see it. What Owen taught me, not by saying it but by showing up, is that integrity doesn't announce itself. It just arrives. He drove from Ottawa with a notary and a Tim Hortons bag and sat with me while I made the hardest decisions of my adult life. And he never once told me what to feel about it. That's a kind of decency I hadn't understood the full weight of until I needed it most. Decency isn't loud, it doesn't keep a ledger, it just keeps showing up. And Meredith, 73 years old with a casserole dish and good eyes. She looked through my window and saw a man who needed help, and she called 911 without stopping to calculate what it would cost her. That's not something you can teach a person in adulthood. Either that quality is there or it isn't, and I think it comes from a lifetime of small, honest choices that nobody sees. The discipline of doing right when it's inconvenient, when there's nothing in it for you. I think about my daughter. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I've earned the right to say it plainly. She was smart enough to know better. She had the intelligence to understand what she was doing when she didn't answer that phone. What she lacked was the will to act on what she knew, and I wonder how much of that is on me. I made it easy to take from me. I never made it necessary to give back. When you remove all friction from a person's life, you also remove the chance for them to build something in themselves. That's the part that sat heaviest with me in those first weeks at home, not the anger. The anger is simple. It burns clean, and then it's done. What stayed was the question of what I had actually built in 67 years, and whether the most important construction project of my life, raising a person who knew how to be decent, had been quietly failing while I was busy writing checks. I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure clean answers exist at 67. What I do have is a burgery named after Margaret, and a Friday dinner with Owen and Meredith coming up, and a left hand that can now hold a coffee mug without help. I have birch trees that went green while I was watching from a hospital window, proving again that the world doesn't pause for your worst moments, which is either devastating or reassuring depending on the day. I choose reassuring. It takes strength to rebuild something after it's been broken, real strength, the quiet, grinding kind that nobody applauds. And it takes clear eyes to look at your own life honestly, to see where you failed and where you were failed, and to hold both things at once without letting either one bury you. That's the work. That's what I'm doing now. One morning at a time, one cup of coffee, one phone call with a daughter who is learning, slowly, what it means to show up. Still here, still building.